possible. And thanks so much to the people who have contributed in various ways to enabling me to be here today. I'm so pleased in particular that Rick Rice, one of the first people to teach me anything about philosophy, I was so looking forward to thank all of you for choosing to be part of it. So I want to talk here in light of the conference theme about what I'll call thinking philosophy and theology together. And I want to start with a quote from a theologian with a name that I think probably had to lead to his being a theologian, John Martin Creed. He said, though philosophy is not theology, and though theology can never wisely identify itself in any exclusive sense with any one philosophy, it is in the very nature of things that each should those connections and interactions which have existed, and we may anticipate that such interactions, perhaps in the future, as in the past, not without friction, will continue, will occur. So what I want to suggest then, perhaps significantly, although their subject matters differ in part, and although while philosophy need not do so, theology seeks to be self-conscious as regards its rootedness in the Christian tradition and understands itself as contributing to Christian existence. Elaborate Christian beliefs using the concepts and vocabulary of any of several systematic accounts of reality, precisely because of their consonance with Christian belief. But it need not do so. It need not be philosophical in this sense. But it cannot avoid attending to its own internal coherence, nor can it consistency, and for comprehensive responsiveness to all of our knowledge dependent on purportedly neutral beliefs or experiences, but can and place what we know and undergo within the Christian narrative. It must then attend to clarity and comprehensiveness and consistency. It must aspire to at least some measure of analytical rigor, and perhaps then there is a sense in which it cannot but be philosophical. In what follows, I seek to spell out my understanding of the activities of theology and philosophy before seeking to show that they are distinguishable but substantially overlapping. I conclude with a recap. So I begin by spelling out how I understand the activities of theology and philosophy. Now, I want to be clear that in doing this, I am not for an instant trying to claim that my choices to use words in particular ways track any sort of Platonic forms, that they are in any sense necessary. I am only explaining how I will use my key terms so we can avoid later confusion. By Christian theology, I understand a critical, reflective activity concerned with the content, adequacy, and implications of Christian beliefs that is conducted self-consciously within the Christian tradition and in support of Christian existence. This activity can take the form of a descriptive, interpretive exercise in intellectual and cultural history, in which the theologian seeks to offer an accurate, contextual interpretation that is designed to show what case we can speak broadly of historical theology, or more narrowly of something like patristic or biblical theology. Theology can also take the form of an analytically informed exercise in synthesis and construction, in which the theologian seeks to show what it makes sense for Christians to believe about a particular topic, to display a particular pattern of interconnection among Christian belief of constructive theology, as well as in different settings of doctrinal, systematic, or, depending on the theologian's focus of inquiry, moral or pastoral theology. It is this kind of theology that is my focus here. When I say that Christian theology is carried on self-consciously within the Christian tradition, broadly construed, I do not mean at all that non-Christian insights are irrelevant to theology, or that theologians should not draw on the work of or engage with thinkers outside that tradition. Thinkers who are not seeking to help Christians think better as Christians can certainly be concerned with the same questions as our Christian theologians. And the Christian community can learn from such thinkers. But I think those thinkers would agree that they themselves are not doing Christian theology. So when, say, Richard Dawkins offers arguments intended to show that belief in God is nonsensical, or when Chris Hitchens seeks to show that it yields morally problematic consequences, they are certainly addressing the merits of Christian belief. But I think it would be at least idiosyncratic to say that either, therefore, is doing Christian theology. Now, how we delimit the range of topics with which theology is concerned, whether we treat a given topic as an object of Christian belief, is to some extent a matter of taste and preference. So among the objects of Christian belief are certainly those topics addressed, I think, in the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene and Chalcedonian creeds, and other topics interestingly related to these. In principle, I think any topic that is related to those central topics and that exhibits the potential to influence personal or ecclesial practice or self-understanding should qualify. It should always be possible to spell out the significance for Christian existence of a theological argument, whether or not the argument otherwise makes any explicit reference to it. But I do think that's part of what it is for something to be a genuinely theological contention. Theology as a whole is carried on within the Christian tradition. This means that it assumes the general aptness of that tradition and will, in many cases, contribute to its development. That does not mean that it is tightly controlled by the views of earlier Christian thinkers, even those whose views are generally accepted. If theology worked in this way, available Christian intellectual resources could never grow responsibly. No, theology may seek to adjust elements of the tradition because traditions are, in the nature of the case, growing, developing realities, growth. It may also seek to enhance the tradition by addressing topics or elaborating arguments that have not previously or employ arguments that are intended to serve Christian life and that are consistent with the tradition, but that are not necessarily intended to become incorporated in the tradition. This might be because they are too narrow or technical. It might also be because they involve ways of spelling out the meaning of aspects of Christian belief that might be treated by their own exponents as options worth considering, but as too uncertainly warranted to be regarded with great confidence. Theology may concern not only general, non-empirical questions regarding the structure of reality and similar topics that rightly occupy philosophers, but also particular questions about matters of fact, most importantly for Christians, those to do with the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. But also, we might note, with empirical regularities, right? So the empirical regularities might themselves be the foci of doctrinal claims, belief that a bent toward wrongdoing is a predictable feature of humanness is the obvious example here. as his belief that the physical world is ordered by laws of nature, reflective of the divine goal that there be increasing complexity, beauty, and conscious action and appreciation through creation. They might also lie at the root of doctrinal or doctrinally related claims. So, for instance, empirical regularities about human social interaction might be among the elements lying behind a plausible contemporary appropriation of the Decalogue's prohibition on theft. So, Christian beliefs might provide context and thus, in effect, guidance for the interpretation of these empirical regularities, but they don't trump empirical inquiry. So, for instance, if somebody makes assertions about female and male dispositions and capacities in order to ground claims about the roles of female and male participants in church life, this may count as a theological claim, but it will not be a claim that is adjudicable except with reference, I think, to real world facts about the capacities and dispositions of actual people as these are ascertained using the best available biological, psychological, and sociological investigative techniques. Appeals to Christian belief do not somehow short circuit inquiry into facts on the ground. Rather, in this case, the facts on the ground are precisely germane to determining what the relevant beliefs ought to be. By making claims about matters of fact, we open ourselves up to confirmation or falsification by means of the best available methods of assessing factual assertions of the relevant sort. By philosophy, I understand a critical, reflective activity concerned with basic aspects of existence, human and otherwise, that are not as such contingent matters of fact amenable to empirical inquiry. I'm not attempting, by offering this definition, to rule out empiricist approaches to particular questions on any a priori basis. I am simply suggesting that the question whether empirical inquiry is the right way to resolve a given question is not itself an empirical question, but that it is a properly philosophical question, and that a question that is properly resolved empirically is not, as I understand the term, a philosophical one. Specific topics may be seen as objects of recognizably philosophical inquiry if they fall within these general constraints. That is to say, they are roughly basic or highly general as well as not empirical, or if they can be located aptly within one or more ongoing conversations that have, as a matter of fact, come to be characterized as philosophical. In a sense, then, we might say, with regard to this latter aspect of the definition I've offered, philosophy just is what philosophers do. Obviously, the identification of individual problems and solutions as philosophical, and the identification of entire strands of inquiry and conversation as philosophical, will interact with each other in various ways. As in the case of theology, philosophy can be concerned with understanding the ideas of thinkers or movements. Here we might speak of the history of philosophy, say, or comparative philosophy. Alternatively, we might be concerned with the formulation of answers to individual philosophical problems or of entire philosophical systems. And we might speak here of constructive philosophy. It is on philosophy in this latter sense that I focus here. Now, when a question is explicitly philosophical, and when it is being undertaken more for its own sake than as a contribution to Christian life, we might characterize the activity of addressing it with appropriate reference to Christian belief. So it's a philosophical question. It's not being undertaken with a focus on its significance directly or indirectly for practice or self-understanding or liturgy, but it is still being undertaken with reference to Christian belief. Then we might talk about the activity of doing this as Christian philosophy. So philosophy can be explicitly Christian then, but obviously it need not be, despite the deep connections between God and every aspect of non-divine reality. Explicit contextualization doesn't help to solve every philosophical problem. Philosophy ought to be explicitly Christian philosophy when the best immediate solution to a given puzzle, and not just the deep grounding for the solution or some aspect of it, involves explicit appeal to God as understood by Christ, reference to some element of Christian belief. Consider the evolutionary argument against naturalism offered by Christian philosophers, including Stephen R.L. Clark and Alvin Plantinga. This argument holds roughly that naturalism, philosophical naturalism, implies belief in unguided evolution. That, in turn, belief in unguided evolution implies that, at least where they're focused on abstract issues, our cognitive faculties are unreliable, and that our cognitive faculties, as understood by naturalists, thus can't be relied on to yield good judgments about the merits of naturalism itself, because naturalism is a theory, and so an abstract idea or set of ideas. So that naturalism, in effect, saws off the branch on which it's sitting. So Clark and Plantinga formulate this argument as self-consciously Christian philosophers. They don't articulate their respective versions of it using theological premises, though one could certainly appeal to it in an explicitly theological context as among the pointers to the effectiveness and comprehensive validity of Christian belief. So if one did this, one would, I think, be doing either theology or Christian philosophy, depending on what one took to be the point of one's activity. If one didn't make reference to this context, one would be doing philosophy. Note that in either case, one would be deploying the same argument. What would make it an argument in theology, in Christian philosophy, in philosophy more generally, would really be the purpose of deploying it, the context in which it's deployed. On the understanding of theology, I'll drop Christian for simplicity's sake, and philosophy that I've elaborated so far. These two intellectual activities share multiple foci. At the same time, not all theological questions are philosophical questions, and not all philosophical questions are theological ones. After explaining where I believe the two activities do and don't overlap, I seek to clarify their relationship by explaining briefly how I understand the contested pairs faith and reason and revelation and reason, saying something along the way about my understanding of revelation more generally. I explain how we might understand differences in method between the two activities of theology and philosophy before considering, in particular, the role of tradition in our theological and philosophical inquiries. So, many philosophical questions are not theological because they have relatively little to do with the content, adequacy, and implications of Christian beliefs. Topics characteristically of interest in the philosophy of chemistry, say, might not be immediately relevant to theological concerns, even though, if all reality is rooted in the being and activity of God, there will finally be some connections. This isn't a hard and fast point, of course, but it seems as if issues in metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics will be most salient to theology. Issues in the philosophy of science, issues focused on scientific method and the understanding of science as a social practice, will likely be relevant to questions of theological method, not so much probably to the substance of theology, but to what, following Fritz Guy, we might call metatheology. Whether particular questions in metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics actually are, at the same time, theological questions or just relevant to such questions will depend, perhaps unsurprisingly, on the specific questions. The less significance these questions have for the content, adequacy, and implications of Christian belief, the less it will make sense to think of them as even potentially theological. Now, while philosophy is concerned with more or less generic features of reality, theology is concerned sometimes with these, but sometimes also with matters of fact that seem, at least some theologians would say otherwise, to be contingent. that could be otherwise. On the Christian view, God's self-disclosure occurs not only of creation in general, but incarnate in and as a particular first-century Galilean rabbi is not something metaphysically necessary. It could have been otherwise, and so it certainly does not mean, of course, that more general considerations, whether theological or philosophical ones, might not be relevant to these historical questions. We might think here, for instance, of Karl Rahner's suggestion that the incarnation is the clearest possible expression of God's immanent presence in creation, a suggestion intended to help us see the occurrence, though not strictly necessary. Similarly, we might expect, a priori, both a divine incarnation and its validation by, one, the behavior of the person who is God incarnate, and two, a miraculous sign of divine approval. This is a proposal Swinburne pairs with the idea that Jesus of Nazareth is far more likely to qualify as the expected divine incarnation than any historical alternative of whom we are aware. This latter point is contingent, historical, but Swinburne offers a particular way of thinking about the evidence, that's clearly philosophical, that shows how that evidence, even if limited, might provide robust support for Christian belief. So both Rahner and Swinburne show ways in which broader philosophical considerations might interact with and affect how we interpret historical evidence. The more general moves that thinkers like Rahner and Swinburne make can be worked out in ways that we can regard as philosophical or in ways that we can regard as theological. Suppose we began with abstract conceptions of God and divine activity, elaborated and defended without reference to a richer understanding of God as conceived of by Christians. So in this case, if we started out in that highly abstract way, we might see the arguments in question as propedeutic to theology, but not from within the frame of Christian belief, and sought to show how making the sorts of assumptions that Rahner or Swinburne made tended to illuminate Christian beliefs and render them more internally supportive or consistent. We might see ourselves instead as doing theology if we deployed these arguments. There is always, it has to be said explicitly, a Christian context for any truth whatsoever. That's because God is at the root of everything that's necessary, everything that's contingent. But this doesn't mean that this connection needs to be made explicit in order to render a given truth apparent. A Christian might believe, for instance, that the truth makers for logical or epistemological or moral or aesthetic propositions were, in reality, aspects of the necessary being of God. So in this case, a full account of these propositions would entail reference to God. But it wouldn't follow that this deep metaphysical point needed to be made in order to assess these propositions. Similarly, a Christian might judge that we have been made for conscious communion with God, and that God would always have intended that we be conscious. And this might, in turn, serve as a deep explanation for the presence of consciousness in the world. But it wouldn't follow that we needed to refer to this deep explanation in order to establish that we at least were conscious, given the inescapable reality of our own consciousness, the fact that it's obvious immediately to us that we are conscious, even though reference to the purposes of God might figure in a deep explanation of the existence of consciousness. Now, distinguishing theology and philosophy, as I've tried to do here, isn't the same thing as distinguishing faith from reason or revelation from reason. Faith is trust, an attitude of reliance. It is not a shortcut to belief, an alternative to reason as a way of generating or assessing beliefs. Revelation is God's act of self-disclosure, but it is what grounds, what explains the availability of truths about God. It is not an alternative means of evaluating proposed beliefs. So theology and philosophy are both activities that involve the exercise of reason. Whether a given event occurred in history is a contingent historical matter, and whether that event discloses God's character, nature, purposes, projects in the world with exceptional clarity is, again, a contingent historical matter. However, the content of any revelation regarding God's nature, character, and general purposes is not contingent. The content of any revelation regarding God's nature, character, and general purposes is not contingent because God's nature, character, and general purposes are themselves necessary. We may come to see that God is love more clearly because of the incarnation, but that God is love is not itself a contingent historical matter, but a necessary feature of the divine being, of who God is. Of course, the disclosure that God is love, a disclosure made in and through the incarnation, may in turn feed back into our more general understanding of God and lead us to see more general reasons to regard God as love. However, it is possible that those more general reasons might be apparent to someone even if that person weren't seeking an understanding of God through the incarnation. Now, there may be exceptions here. So, for instance, we might think that God's self-disclosure, say the resurrection of Jesus, highlighted for us God's intention to confer life beyond death in a way to which the resurrection of the body was integral. But perhaps there might be multiple forms personal life beyond death could take, not all of them involving bodily resurrection. When what God does is contingent, then the content of revelation regarding what God does will be contingent. Now, take a step back. The key point here is that all knowledge of God comes from God. All knowledge of God comes from God. Where else would it come from? The same is true, it has to be said, of all knowledge of the world and of all knowledge of ourselves. Whatever we know because the action of God, the Creator, is at the root of the existence and operation of our cognitive faculties. Because the Logos is the true light which enlightens everyone, as John 1 says. Because the Spirit acts to guide you into all truth. To say that God is present and active everywhere is to say that divine revelation takes place in and through nature, however defined, experience, rational reflection, history, in no case without mediation, in no case infallibly. If divine creation and providence undergird every attempt on our part to understand who God is and what God is up to in the world, it doesn't follow that there is some separate, distinctly theological way of knowing. To say that there was such a way of knowing might seem to be to suggest not only that God was the revealer, as we must say, that God was constantly engaged in divine self-disclosure, as we must say, that all knowledge of God is rooted in God's action, again, something we must say, but also, if there's to be some special theological means of knowledge, that God's self-disclosing action somehow bypassed both human finitude, fallibility, and sin, and also the factors that constrain divine action generally, the factors in virtue of which God's intentions are, as we know, frequently not realized in the world. All knowledge of God is knowledge from God, but it is not therefore conveyed to us free of mediation and constraint. And it does not therefore exempt us from the need to engage in critical reflection and scrutiny. I have to emphasize that that is not because we are entitled to question whether God is truthful, but rather because we need to know whether any proposed belief aptly characterizes God. And of course, we need to recognize that our own critical reflection and scrutiny is itself part of the process by which God seeks to communicate effectively. Divine communication doesn't stop with mystical insight or the production of a document, because God is at work in and through our reception and transmission of any idea or assertion. Again, not somehow exempting us from error. Now, theology and philosophy need not employ different methods when addressing the same questions. But theology addresses questions that are not philosophical and that cannot be addressed, therefore, in the same way as philosophical questions. Theology need not be systematic in anything like, say, Paul Tillich's sense, but it is always systematic in a way that philosophy need not be. Theology is concerned with understanding God and God's world and our lives before God in that world. And that means that a broad range of issues will always, in principle, be in view whenever theological ideas are being formulated and expressed. Theology is necessarily comprehensive, at least implicitly. By contrast, while philosophical ideas are cross-connected too, it may be easier when doing philosophy to consider particular claims in relative isolation, though of course one can choose to address them in relation to a particular system. Now, there are differences in topic between theology and philosophy, as I've already suggested. There are not, I think, deep and insurmountable differences in method. Theological topics that are not philosophical in character can't be addressed using philosophical methods, but the topics that are common to both may be reasonably addressed using the same or similar methods. And while philosophers may attempt to grapple with these questions in other ways, it is certainly open to Christians to approach philosophical and theological questions using the same means. It is sometimes assumed that while theological reflection takes place within the broad bounds of the Christian tradition, philosophy is undertaken in something close to an intellectual vacuum. But philosophical questions can be addressed self-consciously from within the setting provided by Christian belief, per what I said before about Christian philosophy. At the same time, Christian belief leaves open considerable room for intellectual experimentation, and even self-consciously Christian philosophical inquiry doesn't require explicit reference to Christian belief or to theological topics or presuppositions. Both theology and philosophy, it seems to me, require clarity, internal coherence, and consistency with our best considered judgments about other relevant matters. These judgments may sometimes themselves be modified in something like reflective equilibrium, though in other cases this may not be possible, as when modifying them might entail logical error, performative self-contradiction, or denial of the inescapable, like, say, the reality of consciousness. Christian ethics, to take another example, does not employ a method fundamentally different from that of any other sort of ethics. Properly understood, a Christian ethic of natural law is at the same time a Christian ethic of love. A Christian ethic of love just is a Christian ethic of natural law. To put things far too briskly, as I have argued in more detail elsewhere in a little book called Loving Creation, love is concerned with well-being, and Aristotelian Thomist natural law thinking offers a plausible account of the well-being with which love is concerned. So spelling out the nature of well-being also clarifies the diverse shapes and foci of love. Questions of method are conceptually prior to questions of substance, which doesn't, of course, mean that we must always attend to questions of method chronologically at the beginning. But there's no obvious reason to separate theological from philosophical treatments of method. There's a long history of doing theology in light of particular philosophical systems. Theologians have rightly protested against the captivity of theology to these and other systems. At the same time, systems like these can be understood as embodying theological insights rather than as external constraints on theology. The choice to employ them theologically can be seen as reflecting judgments about their congruence with pre-existing theological convictions in search of more careful and rigorous articulation, logically guided, so that the systems are in some sense subordinate to theology. We do not need to do philosophy in the sense of proposing anything like a metaphysical thing wrong with bringing an independently and seeking to learn from it, but there is also no reason not to approach philosophical questions from the beginning theologically. We can begin from within the frame provided by Christian belief and seek to understand its explanatory power rather than bracketing Christian belief. In this sense, philosophy need not come before theology. We can do theology without appealing to philosophical systems, We need not spell out our theological claims in Thomist, Heideggerian, Hartsonian, Hegelian, or similar categories, but we can't do theology without philosophical analysis, without thinking about the logic and internal coherence of our theological proposals, their consistency with the inescapably evident, and about their reflective equilibration with our experience and intuitions. Good theology and good philosophy will involve careful attention to the use of words, the logic of arguments, and the consistency of assertions as well as of background assumptions. We may helpfully distinguish between appeals to general philosophical accounts of reality, metaphysical approaches like those advanced by proponents of process philosophy or Thomism or British idealism, and appeals to logic, clarity, and internal consistency. To start with the former would indeed be to start with philosophy, to treat it as foundational to theology. Someone might do that, but I certainly don't think we're required to. To start with the latter would not be to give philosophy pride of place, but simply to insist that we think clearly. We might, of course, find ourselves appealing to metaphysical, epistemological, or ethical intuitions in the course of what are otherwise arguments about the internal consistency of Christian belief. Some of those intuitions might themselves be traceable to Christian influences, and so in this case, invoking them would simply be a matter of spelling out the internal logic of Christian belief, but some perhaps might not. And of course, Christianity is itself complex and varied. That's an important thing to remember when we talk about traditions. It's complex and varied, with alternative moral, metaphysical, and epistemic stances. To appeal to the Christian tradition is not then to cite simple, clear, unqualified, authoritative statements, but to propose a way of discerning a pattern that must itself stand up to careful scrutiny, both as regards its ability to make sense of our experience and as regards its internal coherence. Philosophy needn't presuppose theological categories, but of course it can, in particular cases, proceed by employing those categories, just as it certainly may take them as objects of reflection or analysis. Now, there is a distinctive Christian tradition or set of interweaving traditions, probably better, of reflection, inquiry, and conversation. Some of it concerned with specifically philosophical topics. None of us begins with exceptional as we arrive in the world immersed in particular social environments. We acquire languages, ideas, attitudes, and habits of mind before we are in a position to reflect on them critically. It is perfectly reasonable to start out thinking from where we are, from how we have been taught to experience the world. We do not need to begin or attempt to begin or pretend that we have begun from scratch, building up an intellectual system on what we personally identify as undeniable foundations. Rather, we can perfectly well begin within a tradition or set of traditions, even as we reflect upon, critique, and enlarge that tradition or set of traditions. And it's not only the case that we are entitled to do so, but also that the prior success of a tradition, its winnowing of ideas and sedimentation of experience, wisdom, and insight, give us good reason to seek to do so, to give our tradition initial weight. That does not mean, of course, as infallible or incapable of growth. It is, after all, the product of finite, error-prone, sinful creatures like ourselves. It simply means that we can accept without any sort of diffidence the recognition that we begin thinking theologically and philosophically in via, on the way, and that we have good reason to welcome the gifts our tradition has given us. In the particular form in which we ourselves appropriate it, there will be as many can, in turn, be validated as it survives credible challenges, as criticisms are either shown to be unsuccessful or else. The authority of tradition comes from its ongoing success in responding to challenges and its insights and experiences. The Christian tradition may suggest topics for consideration, propose particular ways of addressing those topics, and also propose criteria for assessing philosophy operates self-consciously, whether or not always explicitly, within this argument might seek to show how a given conclusion could be defended or a given question addressed by beginning with premises as limited as possible. This seems to be a point of pride for a certain sort of philosopher, to show how narrow the foundations are on which a certain sort of argument can be sustained. And offering appropriate answers to individual philosophical questions will often not depend on explicit reference to resources drawn from the Christian tradition. By contrast, a theological approach to the same conclusion or questions, while it might also allude to the same considerations, might instead seek to show why beginning from within the Christian tradition made possible an effective response. But of course, many philosophical arguments too may involve self-conscious elaboration of particular traditions. The boundaries are messy. Traditions are important, but not all determining. The experience we have as Christians is undoubtedly shaped by our immersion in the Christian tradition. But we are not isolated, immune to all other influences. We live in a variety of overlapping, intersecting streams of cultural influence, each of which offers lenses through which we can look at the world and proposals for our consideration. And if, as I've already noted, the Logos is the true light that enlightens everyone, we should recognize that the various traditions other than the Christian tradition that affect us may mediate genuine insights into reality, and that it may be possible on occasion for us to frame questions and discern answers not necessarily proposed or vouchsafed to us by any particular tradition that's identifiable as such or thinks about itself as such. There's always a history behind what we do, but it doesn't follow that every time we consider or respond to a given question, we're doing so as participants in a particular traditionally defined conversation. Traditions don't shackle us, even if they often guide us. Moral experience can break through tradition-rooted constraints. And I think we can envision cases like this in our own experience or in literature, ones in which people's ideas, ones in which people's experiences are in sufficient tension with the tradition-inspired ways of looking at the world that may seem natural to them, that they cannot but push back against or resist. So the important thing to recognize here then is that tradition matters, but tradition doesn't shackle us. Philosophy and theology have many functions, but I suspect a particularly important one is therapeutic. So I'm not focusing here on the kind of use to which Chuck called attention earlier, that of the later Wittgenstein, where therapy means therapy for the benefit of language that has lost its moorings. I'm concerned rather with therapy conducted for the benefit of religious ideas, attitudes, and practices that have proven conceptually muddled, spiritually toxic, or both. Now, these two activities of theology and philosophy can play their therapeutic roles effectively when they are understood and carried on subject to common methodological constraints and in a complexly overlapping fashion. Philosophy and theology can be defined in relatively abstract terms. Philosophy explores non-empirical questions that are basic to various strands of existence and inquiry. Christian theology considers the content, adequacy, and implications of Christian belief. Both can also be understood in historical, cultural terms as activities in meaningful continuity with recognizable histories, overlapping self-identified guilds. Philosophy and theology both require clarity and coherence. Theology and more systematic varieties of philosophy also require at least implicit attention to the comprehensive context within which each takes place. Philosophy existence to our experience, to our discourse, many of the topics they consider are the same, and both, when they are done well, are marked by precision, transparency, and rigor of thought and expression. Even though we don't need to begin with a methodological essay every time we engage in each activity, each deserves to be informed, shaped, and constrained in virtue of deliberate, reflective awareness of method. Many topics are common to both activities: divine self-communication and other forms of divine action, the meaning of salvation, the nature of human persons, including their identities and their capacities for freedom, what might be involved in particular moral judgment, the shape of a good life. And on the other hand, some topics are distinctive to the historical person Jesus of Nazareth as God incarnate, beyond death. Now, the meaning of is plausibly regarded as philosophical, or perhaps better, simultaneously philosophical and theological. Some topics, similarly, are philosophical but not theological relevance for personal or corporate Christian existence, though even here they may be addressed in part by drawing on both philosophy and theology are responses to divine revelation tradition, though it serves not simply to Christians but also to contribute to the Christian tradition's enrichment and growth. While philosophy can be carried on with conscious reference to Christian belief, it will often not be, even when undertaken by Christians. Recognizing the tradition-laden character of intellectual inquiry does not mean that people are trapped by traditions. People can discern insights obscured or ignored by their traditions, and at the same time, it will make sense for Christians doing philosophy to bring what they believe, understand, know as Christians, to need sharply to distinguish between philosophy and theology when we examine questions of Adventist belief, and indeed in many other contexts. Whether what we're doing counts finally as philosophy or theology or both, what matters most is that it reflects the concern with clarity, coherence, and comprehensiveness common to good philosophy and good theology alike.
It's a delight to be here. So first of all, thank you. Thanks to the organizers for this conference for graciously inviting me to participate, and for the opportunity to respond to an excellent paper from my former teacher, Gary Chartier. And thank you, Dr. Chartier, for your paper and for being my teacher this many years later. So as I was studying this paper, I realized that one of two things must be true. Either I've successfully fooled the right people into thinking that I'm qualified to offer a useful response, or I've not failed anybody, and this is my just reward. So here we are. The second thing I'll say, though, is that there's always a danger in responding to a paper that one enthusiastically agrees with, largely, and so, and I confess that this situation has happened to me today. So as I read the paper, I found myself increasingly unsure of how I was going to most effectively poke and prod, and I've decided that what I'm going to do with this brief time is simply identify some key themes in the paper that I think are deserving of more attention and dialogue. So both Christian theology and philosophy in their own ways, are activities whose definitions are contested, and Gary has clearly strived for highly inclusive definitions, showing that these two activities have considerable overlap and may at times look quite similar. As he says, there are differences in topic between theology and philosophy. There are not, I think, deep and insurmountable differences in method. Theological topics that are not philosophical in character can't be addressed using philosophical methods, but the topics that are common to both may be reasonably addressed using the same or similar methods. Now, as far as I can tell, these differences in topic between theology and philosophy are to do with the respective ends of each discipline. Theology takes place within the Christian tradition, and its objective is to support what Chartier calls Christian existence. In contrast, philosophy is concerned with basic aspects of existence, human or otherwise, that are not as such contingent matters of fact, such that the context of philosophy is far more difficult to describe. As Chartier puts it, philosophy just is what philosophers do. In other words, these are two disciplines that employ many of the same practices and often find themselves addressing the same questions, but they're each striving, they're serving somewhat different purposes. Now, as I understand it, Christian theology, in Chartier's paper, serves the Christian community. Philosophy serves the whole human community. And this is where I think we ought to pause. I don't want to put the matter too simply, but I think there is a tension here to explore. While theology may serve Christian existence, Chartier also indicates that there is always a Christian context for any truth, because God is at the root of everything necessary and contingent. This latter claim, which I wholeheartedly agree with, I think calls for a slight revision of Chartier's definition of theology, not as serving the end of Christian existence, but an activity beginning in the Christian tradition and community and offering a Christian description of the truth in support. And more simply, I wonder if Chartier's descriptions of theology have circumscribed theology in such a way that the potentially fruitful conflict and competition between theology and philosophy has receded from view. We can approach a similar point from a different direction, interrogating Chartier's characterization of philosophy a little more. If philosophy's concerned are those matters of existence that are not as such contingent matters of fact, while Christian theology is concerned with matters of fact that seem at least to be contingent, then the implicit premise of philosophy is that these particular contingent matters are not related to basic matters of existence. But that is, of course, a potentially substantial philosophical and theological judgment. I suggest that something theology and philosophy have in common is the difficult reality that no matter where you start or how you define the activity, you have already made substantial theological and philosophical decisions that may require revision down the road. So in one sense, what I'd like to say, and I think Professor Chartier will agree with me, is that the subject matter of Christian theology is ultimately far broader than philosophy, that Christian theology being, as I would prefer to put it, concerned with God and all things in relation to God, is inherently universal in scope, and even its concern with contingent matters is of great import to basic matters of existence. To illustrate, and this was, I think, a portion of the paper that you didn't hear, Chartier makes the wonderful point that an abiding conviction of his faith is that God is love. The Christian theological account of this truth about God takes shape in at least two principal forms: God's covenantal relationship with his creatures, which culminates in the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus for us, and in the Christian understanding of God as triune. These matters of historical contingency, that is, God's covenant relationship, the Christian claims, are universally true, and they are an account of the existence of God and God's relation to creation I missed my own place here, that that lacks that the love of that philosophy would lack, right? That the love of God is that without sorry, having a hard time here. Lacking an account of the love of God would be a philosophically deficient account of God. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Or to put the matter theologically, if God is triune and God is necessary, then the triunity of God is necessary and ought to affect the way that we understand concepts like being, eternity, time, personhood, and so on. But this is to suggest that what Chartier has termed Christian philosophy ought to be the attempt at explicating the universal import of the content of the Christian faith. This latter point raises the question of sources and authority, which Chartier addressed, but I want to push on a little harder, which I think is one of the more complex issues here. Chartier writes, distinguishing theology and philosophy isn't the same thing as distinguishing faith from reason or revelation from reason. That's in an earlier draft of the paper. It is? Okay. I agree with this point insofar as I believe that faith is and ought to be reasonable, that is, that it can be apprehended by human reason and recognized as rational or fitting, and that the content of faith or revelation to be received by human persons at all must be interpreted critically. However, I wonder what Chartier means in practice when he says that when he says that if we were to say that there's no distinctively theological way of knowing, that if we were to say that, we would be suggesting that God's self-disclosing action bypasses human finitude, fallibility, and sin, and also the factors that constrain divine action generally, the factors in virtue of which God's intentions are frequently not realized in the world. Now, on the surface, of course, I generally agree, and I would only intensify the problem, in fact, by adding that the trouble with revelation isn't just that the human recipient is finite, fallible, and sinful, but also that the one revealed is inherently mysterious, such that to encounter God is to encounter that which is ineffable. And therefore, whatever it is we find ourselves saying when we do theology must be sharply differentiated from what we are speaking about. Yet, what I find myself wondering about is the place of something like the mystical in theology and philosophy. Can there be mystical Christian philosophy? And also about the positive constraints that bound the contents of the Christian faith in order for Christian worship, the Christian spiritual life, and Christian theology and philosophy to get off the ground. That is to say, even if we don't postulate an abstract concept like infallibility, does not all Christian thinking rely on treating certain things as givens? I'm thinking, for example, of something as minimal as saying, Jesus died and is no longer dead. Whatever you mean by dead, and whatever you mean by no longer dead. What these givens are can be a matter of debate, but it strikes me that Christian thought can't get very far if it cannot identify substantive norms that are more than methodological, but are in fact robust truth claims about reality. So I'm not entirely clear what it looks like to put into practice Chartier's suggestion that revelation is what grounds, what explains the availability of truths about God and is not an alternative means of evaluating proposed beliefs. Theology and philosophy are both activities that involve the exercise of reason, he says. But I wonder if he is suggesting that revelation does not serve to norm or correct reason, what the implications are for that, for how theology or Christian philosophy are defined and operate.
Thank you so much, Matt. Brilliant response as well. So we're going to have 15 minutes, I think, approximately for Q&A for both our lecturer and the respondent. So if you guys can come this way, probably sit over at the table we'll be.
Sitting is good.
Yes. It's been a long time sitting.
You want to sit there too? Or just...
All right. Questions?
Yeah, whether you are concerned with an admirably rigorous self-critique on the part of the Christian community. and it's inspiring. My question to you is that this may be kind of a pastoral question. We live in a time when elite thought in the West seems to an onlooker increasingly indifferent to what, in fact, Christian theology has produced in terms of the lived community is meant to serve. It's not only indifference, but often feels like disdain, though not always. There's a lot of, oddly enough, there seems to be in the media more sympathy for Catholicism than for, say, liberal Protestantism. But here's my question. How would you both thought this through, but Gary, you were our main speaker. I'll ask you to respond first, perhaps. What would you say in answer to this simple question? How can the rigor you recommend enable the Christian church to recover from what I think may be called its current malaise?
So I think the malaise is very real. I think that any of us who kind of have in the backs of our minds, memories of a period when theologians might still show up on the front cover of Time as major cultural pundits, can only shake our heads in, startled amazement at how different the world is that we now inhabit. The ability of, I guess I'll say two things in response to your question, neither of which is going to be a very good answer to a really good question. The first is, I don't know necessarily how rigor helps us address the malaise, except insofar as I know that not being rigorous, being sloppy, only I think serves to marginalize us even more, right? If we respond to intellectual challenges, to cultural challenges in ways that seem intellectually irresponsible, seems to me we will find ourselves even more dismissed. The other thing I guess to say is that I've tried to walk a very fine line, whether successfully or not. Matt, I think, has gently asked whether it's been altogether successful. A line marked by taking very seriously on the one side the tradition and immersion in that tradition, while on the other hand hoping for ongoing critical reflection on the tradition. What I would say is, where we think the tradition is right and the culture is wrong, we don't end the malaise by simply throwing up our hands and agreeing with the culture, right? So I think we have to be willing to disagree when we can do that with some confidence. And again, I think rigor helps us to feel more or less confident in particular cases there. You probably have something better to say.
No, I agree with that completely. I think actually, Chuck, to your own paper, I mean, I think that one of the questions that we ought to be asking kind of generally is like, what is the end goal of doing this kind of reflection? And I think one of the answers within the Christian community has to be that whether we're doing philosophy or doing theology, it is serving, in one really concrete sense, Christian preaching. And I don't just mean like what occurs in the pulpit. I mean that really generally. And I think part of the job is to be discerning about where we find ourselves. So I think what is the right relationship of church and state or church and culture? And I think actually there's no once for all answer. We've got to be nimble. And I think one of the realities, if you sort of read the broader room, is that we're in a time where the broader culture looks on Christianity as having lost its credibility for a lot of reasons. And I think that the Christian response ought not be to just run and hide or apologize, but actually to to some degree to go on the offensive. And I think part of that means reflecting back to broader society that it's not as secular as it thinks that it is, there are deeply embedded religious assumptions in our society that ought to be contested. Some of them came from Christianity, others are reversion to pre-Christian paganism. I think we ought to talk about those really openly, academically and also homiletically and in ecclesial life. I think people ought to know that.
So my question is a bit on a tangent, but it's been gnawing at me this whole session, like whole day. And it's a question to everyone, so if anyone has an answer, I'm here. Because it's a thing I struggled with, and I haven't found an answer, and I want to hear a good answer. So I have some experts here and some experts here. So you talked about two discourses, theology, philosophy, but we in the Adventist world have a third discourse, which is the spirit of prophecy through Ellen White, which is different from philosophy or theology, right? Because both of these are humans grappling with the word, right? Ellen White, on the other hand, is possessed by the word, isn't she, right, in a way? So what happens in our context, and this is a genuine question, I'll tell you why in a second, what happens when our grappling with the word as theologians or philosophers, like I grapple as a philosopher, some of you grapple as theologians, what happens when what we discover contradicts this other logos that is also present in our community? And I've encountered this when I'm teaching in seminaries. I come up with new interpretations of the Bible, which clash with what Ellen White has said. And so I didn't even know that was a thing until it happened to me. And so I'm wondering, how do we address this problem, right? How have you addressed this problem? I'm curious. So it's just a question of throwing out there, what about the third logos, right? We have theology, logos, theos, logos of philo, and the third, the logos of the spirit of prophecy, which characterizes us as a community, which distinguishes us from other communities. What happens when there's a clash? Of course, between philosophy, we can evaluate philosophy, but what happens between the clash between our grappling with the Bible, the theologians, the exegetes, the commentators, the new interpretations coming forth, and this historical contribution by Ellen White? So just to all of you, I'm very curious how you deal with that.
It would be odd if I was the one to answer this question.
But you started talking.
Yeah, okay. I think this is, I'll be odder still. I actually think that there are like analogs to this that are worth exploring. Certainly, right, in like general Protestant thought, there's the question of the place of tradition. I actually think, though,
It's not tradition, though.
well, no, it's not really tradition, right? So I actually think the community that has thought most carefully about sources of theology that have varying degrees of authority is the Catholic Church. And so I actually think that the Catholic Church's relationship to different degrees of authoritative statements is probably the best guide for how to think about Ellen White. No, what I mean is this. So for example, in the Catholic Church, right, a papal statement is of one kind of authority, but a papal encyclical is of another kind of authority. A papal statement ex cathedra is of its own kind of authority. Like they're not all the same.
Conciliar declaration.
Yeah, exactly, right? So like you could disagree with the catechism as a Catholic because it has no actual authority, right? It's a descriptive statement. So like anyway, that's also, thinking of Catholics, the person who's also really thought really well about this is Newman with regard to matters of faith, the community, and individual conscience. And I think that Newman has done a really good job of showing that a faithful Christian life is one in which we must be faithful to our community and never violate our own conscience. And that's something that's become official Catholic teaching, that like, even if your conscience is wrong, it is the thing that you are bound to. And that's important. This is true.
You want to contribute to whoever wants to.
Yeah, I can say one thing to Abby. I'm one of 5 people in this room who was a month ago this weekend at the PUC conference that Eric Anderson put together on Ellen White for today. And the bottom line, Abby, is that there is even more evidence of Ellen White's humanity and the need for many of us educated, well-read people to take her off of the pedestal that we have placed her on. And so you're going to be hearing more and more about that. But it does raise an issue because that information is actively, in some cases, being membership doesn't want to hear these things, even in the 95% or so of the Adventists who are particularly outside of the North American division. But in the North American division, there are many who don't. So it does, it's a live tradition in that you can have this comprehensive index and look up just what happens. But then there is the other smaller group of people who are the most knowledgeable Adventists and where they are. So the question, I think, is whether the denomination can remain one. Can the tent expand enough to abide all?
We're going to have to allow others to voice their questions as well, but I'm sure Abby would love like a group of people talking to her later. Alex.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. We were very thoughtful about the response. So tradition matters. I appreciated that line and the caveat there that it doesn't shackle us. And I look to talk about ways that we find philosophy helping the philosophical discourse, methodology, helping us understand how Adventists can use philosophy to perhaps pursue their religious commitments and negotiate with tradition. I love Matt, if you would want however you like, but given your commitments to Christian tradition, writing you've done, I'd love for you to maybe help us think about ways that the Christian project has negotiated this a lot longer than Adventism has, and maybe there's ways about shackling.
So Matt has really been put on the spot here, and I'm immensely grateful for his presence, but I feel like he should have at least a moment to collect his thoughts, which means I need to come up with something to say in response to your very sensible question. I mean, it's interesting, right, that and I think Adventists have had various kinds of relationships with philosophy over time. Someday somebody's going to write an interesting paper offering a history of that. The observation this morning, in Zane's paper about the way in which, say, Locke indirectly impacts the thinking of, say, somebody like D.M. Cannon, talking about Adventist anthropology is, I think, just fascinating. That Canwright early on basically sort of repeats Locke's question in defense of a kind of materialist Adventist anthropology. Can God give matter the power to think? Well, if so, then what do we have to worry about? We can be philosophical. And so on from very early in the question, I guess, is how can they be helpful now? And I suppose the most obvious thing can prompt us to think through the implications of what we want to say in particular cases, and to ask whether those implications are implications we're comfortable with. I think sometimes we assert things confidently, perhaps even smugly, without being altogether sensitive to what path we've embarked on in virtue of doing that. I think any specific example of an issue related to Adventist belief that we might raise here could easily occupy an entire conference. And you would, I think, rightly insist on an article and not rather than just a throwaway line from either of us about this. But I would just say that's, at the most general level, we don't always think through the implications of what we have to say, and philosophy forces and helps us to do that.
Yeah, excuse me. I've been thinking, as Gary's been speaking, about some examples in the tradition that I think the meeting of theology and philosophy were fruitful. In my view, the most significant example, of course, is the development of Trinitarian doctrine, where the language of being, of hypostasis, things like that, is not native to the Bible. The proclamation of the Christian faith in the Greco-Roman world was able to take these concepts, massage them as needed, and subsequently the Christian tradition had a kind of effect on the ongoing philosophical tradition also. So it's not as though some words to articulate theology. It also, Thomas Aquinas, I think, is probably the best example here, where Aristotle in his metaphysics is very happy to identify existence and essence, right? So and Thomas says, actually, that's like the difference between creator and creature. A creature is that whose essence is not its existence, right? Or vice versa, right? God is the one in whom essence and existence coincide, and that's kind of definitional. And that's, we can maybe argue with him if we want to, but the point is, there's something there that's incredibly fruitful that ended up enabling a wide array of interfaith conversations. I think we often think that the encounter with other religions is a modern reality. It's just not. I think in many ways, I'm of the opinion, and it can be contested, that the earliest Christian generations treated philosophy largely as the theology of another religion. And when we talk about philosophy, I think we could say just as easily, what positive benefit is there if we dialogue with the theology of Hindus? And I think there's lots there, right? So I think we can look at the whole Christian tradition as the constant conversation that the church has had, mostly with Greeks. And the question was, how does the philosophical source give us a little bit more wiggle room theologically? Is that a helpful way to reframe that? And I think that there's something to that that's worth contemplating. I don't have the best answer to it. I suppose when I think about the development of Christian doctrine, to go back to the first example of the concept of being, I think the native biblical language is creator and creature, right? And we could have done the entire history of Christianity with just saying God's the creator, we're the creature, and that's that. But introducing this Greek concept of being, where there's degrees of being, which is again more native to a religion that could have multiple deities or degrees, kind of a hierarchy of being, that did enable Christianity to think in really creative ways about a variety of problems. Like we heard a whole paper in sacraments, the God-world relation. So I think that there's ways of thinking about it. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yeah, thank you both for your comments. I had a question about, Gary, several points in your paper, you talk about these systems, you know, the Hegelian, the Hegelian, the Heideggerian, and how Christian theology can relate to those in different kinds of ways. So I'm just kind of wondering, in the proposal you've made, are you should be informed by any kind of system that you're saying that theology should be accountable to or in dialogue with, or is it just kind of like, I don't know, like a blend of different kinds of systems? It seems like you have like, you know, comprehensiveness, clarity, concision. These are standards that are coming from somewhere. So I just love to hear just kind of your thoughts on your proposal's relation to any kind of system of thinking.
Yeah. So I suppose I've always got the ghost of Carl. You know, don't let the gospel be captive to a system of some kind or another. And so while I'm very sympathetic to insights from approaches, try to, you know, there, whether, you know, any one of those systematic approaches. So I want to think that, you know, are there influences from particular schools of thought? And the answer may be on the front you're talking about, almost a kind of pragmatism and a willingness to sort of not, I think, dogmatically rule out appeals to more systematic views, but really just to say, I'm mainly interested in good arguments about this, that, and the other thing as we find ourselves immersed in them. Comprehensiveness and consistency as requirements go from theology accountable to reality, as that reality, the reality of God, the reality of what God has created, and, you know, perhaps in part just spelling out what I take to be the you know, the logic of concern with truth, and partly probably just you know, as an empirical matter, theology seems to be concerned with the big picture and what does that mean? And it means, it seems to me, probably some concern with the comprehensive. So I'm shying away from system here, not because I'm in principle opposed to it, though again Bart's ghost thinks I should be, but first and foremost because for purposes of this paper, I felt like all I needed to do was to emphasize what I thought was kind of inescapable philosophical, you know, activity as a component of theology. This concern with rigor and clarity and attention to everything that was potentially relevant, rather than an attempt to construct an overall, you know, kind of coherent package. Maybe I should have done more there.
Well, I was just curious as to what the possible relationship was. I wasn't suggesting you should.
Okay.
We only have 2 minutes before we are kicked out, quite literally, of this room. So I want to give the opportunity for Nate to quickly take his question if I can.
Appreciate the paper, clarity, coherency, intelligence, but I questioned about comprehensiveness, and I pick up on Matt's comment. There was a sense of basis of authority. A 20-page paper on Christian theology and philosophy, and there's not one word mention of Bible. Biblical is in there, but the title could almost be philosophy and natural theology.
And I'm wondering how, like, especially with the Adventist rules, like 95% are, I believe in natural theology, but many Adventists don't. I think it's very important. How would you frame or address your paper in terms of the authority of the Bible and what impact that makes on theology and its relation to philosophy?
So I think there's probably more than a minute and a half to be said about that topic. You know, I take it that we want to begin with the recognition that anything we know or could know about God has to come from God, that there's always a priority of grace and a priority of revelation, and that we unavoidably are shaped by a whole range of both, you know, sort of substantive claims and so forth that come to us as Protestant Christians, especially through the Bible. I think we also should recognize at any rate, that communicative activity is, it has to be understood in relation. There's not going to be anywhere near enough time to talk about this, but I think we have to start out with the recognition that God's intentions are often not realized in the world. We have to ask why that is. We have to ask what that means for divine communication with humans and our reception of that communication. And I think that certainly affects not our recognition of the priority of the Bible for our history, but how we appropriate that. And I think that's more than probably we have time to say. Yeah.
We think our